Today on the tabletop, I'll be talking about Battleground HD, a miniature skirmish wargame. So if anyone has followed my channel for a while, know I am a fan of miniature wargaming, and especially, I have to say, for World War II stuff, I always was a big fan of, bolt action. I enjoyed that game, and absolutely love Chain of Command. And I played these for a while, but I'll say, back in the day, I used to play a lot of Battleground. In fact, it was Battleground World War II. Is a World War II platoon-sized skirmish game. And I really enjoyed it. And I found out actually last year that they have a new version that's out. They sort of updated some of the mechanics and stuff. And I think in a way, it takes up a different gaming space on the tabletop. I think it's something that you might want to check out. Now, I have to say, like I mentioned, back in the day, I just love this game. It came out like maybe late 90s. In fact, I have some of the printed rule books, but they sort of got lost in the ether. But as you can see, I just had tons of stuff in there. I enjoyed the game quite a bit. It was a lot of fun. It had some interesting aspects of the games at that time. One was a random initiative. You assign units a card. You simply use a deck of cards. Let's say red cards for one side and black cards for another, or cards of a certain suit. And each unit would have a specific card that would be assigned to it. So you shuffle that deck together and deal it out. And as a card is dealt, that unit would activate and do its actions. And everything was man-to-man. So you fired on individual models, individual move of models and stuff like that. And it had some pretty cool ideas. The idea of machine gun fire was based on cones that you could have like overlapping, and you had suppressive fire, that kind of stuff. And it was pretty cool. And what I liked about it particularly also is it uses a 20-sided die, which is neat, and it's still used in this game system here. And that allowed a little bit of gradations of modifiers. And originally it was based on, you had a certain 2-hit number, you have a bunch of modifiers to that, and then you just basically roll for effect. And they've done something a little bit different with this game. But I wanted to maybe just talk a bit more about Battleground and sort of how this game sort of works and what some of the neat things that they have going with it. Now, I will say with Battleground, what's interesting about this is it really is a core set of rules that are a little flexible. In a way, it sort of reminds me a little bit of Lock and Load Tactical. The idea is like they have their base game, and there's different things they do with that. And obviously, it's World War II for this one, Vietnam. They do a Cold War gone hot. Basically, they're looking at the idea of a Cold War in the 80s with the Soviets coming in against NATO. And so it's pretty cool that they have a lot of different variety of conflicts that they sort of want to emulate using the system. What you're going to find for this is that, again, as I mentioned, every unit will have a card assigned to it. And when it's activated, every model basically has 2 phases of activation. You basically declare all your actions that you're going to do for your models, execute them simultaneously, and then you get another action. And so the idea is, you could have your units fire twice, or you could have them rapidly move and then lay down some other fire. You could have some guys go prone, and it's quite neat that you have each individual miniature doing certain action. So your units can be represented by these unit cards. And again, as I mentioned, that this entire squad will have a specific activation for a specific card that's assigned to it, and you can split that up if you want to. And the idea really is they have like a general number for the morale, and then their field craft, their different modifiers, let's say, for how fast they move. And then, of course, you have your different effective ranges. So you have effective range, long range, and extreme range. And the idea also you have something point blank. And then you sort of have this little layout, a little bit of some of the equipment they have. So it's like a certain soldier will have, of course, their Car 98 and some different ammunition in case it jams, and they could sort of unjam it, amount of grenades or extra ammo, that kind of thing. And this is a pretty cool way of just sort of keeping track of some of the gear that they have. Now, as I mentioned, though, it's very model specific. So, if you have a guy that jams and then they clear that jam, you want to have some type of indication specifically for that model. On top of this, what's later on that is a weapons card. And then it will indicate for, let's say, Car 98, the different ranges that you have. And in addition to that, then, what they use here is battle dice. On the old system, that you basically would roll a d20 on a table and sort of see what happens. And then here they sort of change that a little bit. And the idea is that you have these different colored dice with different faces on it. And that would represent the fire that you can put out. And most of the automatic weapons, what I like about this is that you're going to roll the hit. You'll have a few modifiers. So you might have modifiers for range, or if you're doing burst fire. And of course, that might be countered if you're underneath leadership or maybe you just take one specific action to aim. And so there's not a lot of different modifiers. And typically what you're working off here is what they call your field craft. And usually that's about 10 for most of your normal troops. So you figure roll a die, you got a 50-50 chance, and then there might be some modifiers that can sort of shift that a little. What's sort of cool though is, I think especially mostly for the automatic weapons, is that even if you miss, you still will have some types of dice that you can roll that can add some type of suppression of something of that sort. And that's what's pretty cool about it. Now, the counter to that is that you have lots of cover, or if models are prone, and then they're going to roll different dice. And so you're basically rolling these two pools of dice and counteracting it with whatever your cover saves are. Now, as I mentioned, they use these specific dice that have a number of pips on it, and then they'll have certain conditions. And you can see as the color moves up, let's say from a white to black, you're going to have more severe results. Likewise, for defensive dice, you'll either have 1 pip, 2 pips, or 3 pips. And this might be, again, if they're like in a stone building or a bunker, they would be rolling these dice. What's cool about this is that you don't need to have these special dice. You do need to have a bunch of 6-sided dice of different colors, but they have this really cool table in here that can say, okay, if it's 4 or better, this is what you're going to roll. And typically it's 4 or better. And then if you need to be noting of 6s usually have the worst result. You basically roll your dice for your action, then your defender will roll dice. And then what the defender can do is that the amount of pips that they score, they can cancel out individual dice. And I like that. It's sort of a little bit engaging, a little bit of back and forth. It's a pretty cool way of handling that. And again, it's not so much a point of the way old this used to be, like you just sort of sat there, your opponent just figured out modifiers, they shot, they figured out who they killed or how bad they hit, and that was it. This is a little bit more engaging. On top of this, what I appreciate is that you have a lot of chances for opportunity fire, you have a lot of chances of reaction. So if I am getting shot at, let's say if I'm out in the open, I have a chance to make a type of morale check or a type of leadership check and basically go prone, and that'll give me some defensive dice. And that's a pretty cool thing. It's a little bit more fluid than what you'd typically expect. Another thing I find really interesting is that you're not keyed into unit coherency. Units are going to have a communicative range, or if they're in range of their leader, then they can have some benefit of their leader doing that. But you don't have to stay that way. So if you have a squad, you say, look, I want to have this element like these 3 guys go around and flank somebody, and I'll have my main force stay here, lay down suppressive fire. You can do that. Now, of course, the guys on their own, they're a little bit more fragile. If they get shot up, they're more likely to get pinned, and then they might even necessarily break. They're not going to keep as cohesive as they will in that larger squad that has their leader with them and has other guys around, so they can sort of rely on their strength of numbers to overcome casualties that they get. But it's cool. I like the way that it's that flexible. Now, some other aspects of the fire too that you have templates. This is a common template that you'll use. So when you fire a target, you can say, I'm going to direct all my fire to that. But if you're using, let's say, an automatic weapon, it can hit a couple of other guys. Then you can sort of like lay this on where the specific model is, and you can sort of maneuver this around to try to see if you can hit more guys. And like whoever basically is underneath this template or partially underneath it can be a potential target. And they've got like cool templates for grenades and for other weapons. It's cool with the vehicles. They have these little turn keys here that you can use for a vehicle, like how far it turns along, basically using that. And so I put it out in a transparency, and then I use a self-laminator to make them a little bit thicker. But these are files that you'll get downloaded with the PDF. There's also rules for vehicles, and I dig this. This is a little bit reminding me of like an older edition of 40K where you had a profile of the vehicle and you actually would roll the hit. And that's what they sort of incorporate with this one. So depending on the facing, you roll in this chart here, and it could show you that maybe you'll get a little bit more penetration, or more likely like this will cause issue hitting it in the tracks with it getting bogged down. And so that's a cool thing that they have with this, and I dig it. They have all sorts of different charts for different vehicles, and I think it just layers on a little bit of some detail on that that's pretty cool that might be more abstract for some other systems. Now, the game does use quite a bit of tokens and things to keep track of, because it is like maybe for individual models and some of the things that they undergo with certain conditions. I'm a big fan of Litgo, and I have a lot of different Litgo counters that I use for keeping track of stuff. And so I can sort of use these for ideas if it's a jammed, or if they have a unit that's pinned, or they're exhausted, these kind of things, or definitely wounded. I can keep track of these sort of things and utilize this kind of stuff. But it is a little token heavy. Now, another expansion they have is for Vietnam. And I think that they are going to probably put out some more general rules dealing with this. But they have an AI system, and I like it. I still have to play around with this a little bit more. The game heavily can rely on a fog of war type system where you can have units on the board, but they're hidden. They necessarily can't be seen. As they do certain actions, they'll generate noise and do things, being undercover, being out of line of sight. And, you have to have a counter to that, other units that can just continue trying to make spot checks to sort of see that and then react appropriately. And so they incorporated that into a automated AI system where you have 3 decks of cards. They're unaware whether the unit is aware of something else that's on the table. On alert, that means like they definitely know they're like a high combat mode. And so you can have different units out there, and how they react will depend on their stance. And you draw a card from this deck, and they'll tell you whatever you need to do. The unaware, for example, there'll be a lot more blank cards. So you might just draw for that one card there. They're unaware, they don't know what's going on, so they're not going to do anything. Whereas they might necessarily patrol a little bit more, or maybe shift around, or maybe do another look, that kind of thing. And as that unit becomes more proactive and more aware of the enemy out there, they sort of shift from these decks, and these decks become more and more proactive. And it's cool for some of these too that they do have some different conditions on here. So again, this card here, if there's no player in line of sight, you'll do this, but if there is no figure in line of sight or in spot range, then it will do this action. Of course, there's a figure in line of sight, it'll go ahead and shoot, but if there's no figure in line of sight, then it'll just do a move action. And so it does have these little conditions in some of these cards. It's not quite as developed as I like. I might tinker around with this a little bit, but again, this sort of reminds me of Lock and Load Tactical. They have a solo AI bot system. And that's a similar thing. Like you draw a card and then you sort of go through these different conditions. If there's a target in range, then it'll fire. Or, if you have a more aggressive stance of that target, the target's in range, it might actually assault it. So these cards sort of do the similar kind of thing. And I'm eager to really try this out and see how this works. So the layout of the game is very nice. Now, I printed this out in black and white, but it's cool because you can't quite see this here, but they have these little color codes. And you can see a little bit sort of for my terrain here. The idea on your table of contents, they have different colors for that, so you can go through and find specific sections aligning with that color. Well laid out, nice specific rules. Another thing I think is an interesting idea is they have on these sections here a little QR code that you can use. And so if you want to sort of see like how does Battle Dice work, like how does I can read through the rules, but I want to get a little bit more of a defining example, you can basically scan this and it'll take you to a YouTube channel that'll have a little video, maybe, at the most of 5 minutes, like 2 to 5 minutes. And they just sort of describe how that certain rule section works. And they all sort of have that. And that's pretty cool. It's just a nice little overview of that. So there isn't necessarily a lot of specific examples of, let's say, a lot of graphics. They sort of rely maybe on those videos, but they do have more detailed examples of, this is the dice that you roll, and this is the sort of thing, sort of walk you through that. In this aspect, I think that it's a very well organized book. I love too that it has a nice index, all sorts of different keywords so you can look this up. So well organized book. And it is very nice looking. Of course, I printed out mine black and white. I want to save a little bit of cash there rather than getting color, but it's all full color and they really incorporate some neat things in the design with that. Now, I have some bugaboos. These are gorgeous. They're cool. Obviously, you want some color because you need to see the dice that you're using. At the same time, if I'm printing this out on my own, it's going to sort of blow out my ink cartridge. Especially like some of these here, it's a nice sheet. It has a nice layout. But I mean, gosh, do you need to have this full chunk of black in here? It doesn't really matter. I mean, could you maybe just have this sort of switched around that this would be gray with like little black text? And that way it might be a little bit easier on your printer cartridge printing this stuff out. And that's a little bit of my complaint somewhat. I mean, the stuff is gorgeous, but I also wish that they might consider some of the assets, like some of the cards, the unit cards, the weapon cards, these kind of things, like maybe having a low print option. It's interesting for the battle dice, they have something like that. These little, you can print out little stickers to put on that you don't necessarily color, but I wish they had something similar that could do so, some of the peripheral stuff they have. My other complaint with this too is that I wish it had more in the way of scenarios. I honestly say like the Battleground World War II, the old original one, they had a great set of scenarios in there. And I like the idea too that it was very progressive. In the first scenario, you had two squads, like two Soviet squads and two German squads. You sort of move together, do a meeting patrol engagement, and you sort of learn the system playing it that way. And then you do the same scenario with maybe three squads. And then you can move up to another scenario where you add a vehicle. And it would slowly add more elements to it to sort of break you in the game. And they don't necessarily have that with this. I mean, you're buying just the rule system. You need to look at some of the other stuff that they have. And there are some things that are free that are out there. But, most of the stuff they've got, you're going to have to pony up and to see if you buy the Vietnam units and have stuff that's specifically rated to Vietnam. And that sort of makes sense a little bit. You don't necessarily get all the rule sets for all the different things because there would be different periods that you're not necessarily focused on. But, I wish they had a little bit more of some generic scenarios in here to give you a better idea of that. In that aspect too, I'll say it's very much a wargamer's wargame. The old system sort of had a point value system, which, had flaws. And, it's hard to get a perfectly balanced army based on points alone. This is very much more so like, you've got maybe a couple squads, maybe one squad that might be on defensive. You just sort of have to meander through and sort of figure out like what would be sort of a fun engagement. Also, the idea too, like terrain is a little bit more loosey-goosey somewhat. You could say like, well, this is area terrain, this is linear terrain, and there's ways of how they function, but like specific examples, they necessarily have that. They sort of allow you to go through and figure that out yourself. So talking about Battleground HD and things I like about it, how this sort of fits in the tabletop space that we have right now with different war games. I appreciate the idea that it's heavily focused on the fog of war. It's really incorporated in those rules immediately. And it encourages you to use those. And it has a system there to have these things that you're moving around the tabletop, but your other guys just may not be necessarily aware of that. And even then, if you don't know that they're there, there's still some things that you can do to react to it. And, if you know there's a unit in this house and you necessarily haven't spotted them, you can still shoot at that house. You're just not going to have very effective fire, but you can do that. And I appreciate that it allows you to do these sort of things. Specifically, what I like about it is it's very model specific. So the idea of morale, you're not having a whole unit break. You're having individual models break. They'll run, seek cover, or they'll surrender. And so I will say that can be a little odd maybe with trying to manage everything. You might be using more of a platoon game. This could be a little unmanageable with that because you have a lot of little things to keep track of. You have individual soldiers. As you get more familiar with the game, it's probably a little easier to do. But I think like jumping in, probably doing a full platoon is going to be probably a little harder to do. And it's interesting too, that the game themselves that they have, the different expansion they have out, it's a little bit more small unit action. It's usually like a squad or two. They might be moving in to do something to take over a certain area, or maybe to blow up a house or something like that, or try to recover something, or even just necessarily just probe and sort of see what's out there and get off the battlefield. And you have, let's say, defensive units or a meeting engagement involved with that. And that's cool. And it has the rule system involved to do that, with these ideas of fieldcraft and what you're using for your actions. That becomes very flexible. You can say, look, I need to have a technical skill for, let's say, disarming a mine. It has that structure, that framework of doing that. At the same time, I think it's a cool layout that they have for these things. It's very glossy and colorful, and it's very specific for some stuff that you can do. And the idea too, I do sort of like they have very broad cutoffs for certain skills. So usually, like I said, to spot something or the fire, you typically have your typical field craft or a certain morale check. If you're pinned, or say for certain conditions, say for morale, you have your base morale, but if you have a pin, then it's half that value, or maybe a quarter of that value. And that's sort of what you're using as these broad checks for that. And so it's pretty easy, I think, to run these type of systems. It just comes down to the bookkeeping sometimes. I think that might be a little bit sticky. I enjoy the AI cards. I'm quite excited to try this out and see how these work on the tabletop. Definitely think I'm going to be getting a little bit more playtime of that and just sort of seeing how that sort of goes. Now, I'm going to say I appreciate the rules too because they're pretty flexible. If you're looking at light infantry, arms, action, this system sort of covers that. Definitely do World War II and Vietnam, and again, a Cold War gone hot. That's all out there. But I honestly see something like sci-fi. They have some example system out there. I swear I can totally see this taking off like as a sci-fi type game, that somebody puts out their own version of some of the units and different weapons and maybe some different basic tech. In fact, I might experiment that on my own, because I think there definitely can see, you've got a squad of guys, a squad of mercs coming in to do something, a very small unit action, and you want to sort of have something that's very dynamic and a lot of interesting individual models doing things and their reactions upon themselves rather than glossed over as a whole unit. It has that room to breathe in that. So yeah, there are other things out there that cover World War II, platoon-based skirmish. But what I like about Battleground HD is it's a different take on that. It occupies a different space. It has a little bit more gradation and detail for individual models and how they react. It's very fluid for movement and the squad dynamics of breaking them up. You're not locked into this coherency of this big blob of units. If you want to have a couple guys like basically break off and work as fire teams, you can do that in the system. I love the idea that things are hidden and that, you have that incorporated in the gameplay as a base alone. And that's really a big factor of how things play out. And that's really cool. Likewise, too, I enjoy the task resolution, the idea that you've got these battle dice. I know it's a little gimmicky with the colors and stuff like that, but at the same time, too, it's more engaging when you're shooting at targets and they get to roll some dice and you can sort of counteract that. And so I think it's interesting. And it does some things that are a little bit different from what you see out right now. And I'm really excited to see Battleground rules get some new life again. And I think Battleground HD, it's definitely something to check out. Can't wait to get it on the tabletop.